Okay, as promised, I want to continue to try to get this material over to you and help you prepare for test two coming up again next week. Uh, I'm in the book on page 96 and on your PowerPoint, these cognitive socialization. So we're talking about a guy named Vygotsky, and I probably mentioned him in chapter one, I'm not sure, but it's a cognitive theory, and he came up with the concept of how we develop cognitively, disagreed with Piaget's theory, in that Piaget believed it happened in abrupt stages based on age, uh, and that you understood more sophisticated material and could think at a higher level because you were getting older. Vygotsky, on the other hand, believes that we increase our cognitive abilities based on our cognitive environment. So I think chapter one, I mentioned to you that the cognitive environment involves three things. One is the interaction or the social interaction with a skilled individual. The second is culture. For instance, our Western culture, we push education a great deal, whereas some cultures in third world countries don't. And finally, technology. So whatever resources we have available, technological resources. And if we have these things, we're considered to be in an enriched environment or an enriched cognitive environment, and we can accelerate our cognitive development. And obviously, an impoverished cognitive environment would mean that our development would move more slowly. Now, you should have already kind of picked up on all that from chapter one. The additional information now in this chapter is found again on page 96 in paragraph 2, and he calls this way of incorporating this information the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development. His concept says that some tasks are too difficult to master alone, but with the help or assistance of a skilled individual, culture, or technology, you could master those tasks. So what I want to do is take that and divide it into two parts. Some tasks are too difficult to master alone. So if you're trying to learn a skill, a foreign language, how to play a musical instrument, and you're just doing it by yourself, you have no assistance, no help, no skilled individual teaching, then you are trying to master it alone. But he says those tasks are too difficult. On the other hand, the second half of that says, however, with the help or assistance of a skilled individual, your culture or technology, you could master the task. You could begin advancing, accelerating your development in that area. So if you were trying to learn a foreign language by yourself, struggling, you only have a foreign language dictionary, you're not going to advance very quickly. On the other hand, if you then met someone who spoke that language and made friends with them and they helped you or took a class or logged on a video of some sort, then you would accelerate your development in that specific domain. Now, when you were the first half of the zone of proximal development, when you are trying to master a task alone, figure 5 on page 96 calls that the lower limit of the zone. So when you're working by yourself and struggling, that's the lower limit of the zone. At the point at which you begin to receive assistance, you move to the upper limit of the zone. So that's what the zone of proximal development is about. Just keep in mind it's a social theory. It's a cognitive theory based on a social premise, whereas Piaget is a cognitive theory based on a biological premise. The contrasting and comparing of these two men is on page 97, figure 6. So where Vygotsky would see education as an important factor, school and so on, Piaget said, well, it's a good thing, but it's not going to advance your cognitive development. So whereas Vygotsky says there are no stages, Piaget says yes, there are stages. So it kind of shows you some of the difference between the two men. At the bottom of that page 97, the information processing view, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I gave it to you in the first chapter. Nothing has changed in this chapter. You input information, you store information, you retrieve information, and that's all at a certain speed at which you process that information. So just what I talked to you about in Chapter 1 will still apply on Test 2. I am now on page 99, and we're moving on to some other cognitive development that we haven't yet discussed, and that's attention and memory. On page 99, under attention, first off, just the basic definition is it's concentration and focus of your mental effort. So someone is saying, please concentrate, I need your attention, please focus, and that's what they're talking about. There's a number of different types of attention. I'm going to cover the first two, and that's all I'm going to ask that you be aware of for the test. And the first one is called selective attention. And selective attention is when you can focus your attention on one stimuli and ignore all others. So let's use an example of homework, a child doing this homework, and a radio is playing. And the mom says, turn the radio off, you can't possibly be paying attention to what you're doing. And the kid then shows the parent maybe the math homework, and they're getting all the problems correct. And so the answer is yes, you can focus on one stimuli while ignoring all others. The kid is very aware that the radio is on, but it's not a distraction. And they call that selective attention. ADHD kids have a very difficult time with selective attention because they can't really dial out the distractions around them. The second one I want you to be aware of is divided attention. And divided attention is when you can attend to two different stimuli at the same time. So same scenario, kid's doing his homework, he's working out the math problems with the radio playing with music and humming along with the tune or even singing the song as he does the math work. In other words, he is able to, he or she, to divide his attention between both stimuli and makes perfect sense. So that's divided attention. The second half of this is talking about memory on page 100. Memory is the retention of information over time. I've put them in order for you of short-term, working, and long-term. So let's go over these. But let me say this. I have a tendency to say if it doesn't get into your long-term, you probably haven't really learned it. But for our purposes and according to the author, any forms of memory, you've learned something. So it's all part of learning. So I'll leave it at that. However, having said that, short-term memory is very limited in capacity and time. And what I mean by that is most experts say that in your short-term memory, you will only retain information for no more than about 30 seconds, and then you will lose it. And the other part about short-term memory is capacity. It can't be a lot of information, even for that 30 seconds. So an example would be a phone number. We assume that we can hold 7 digits in our head, look it up, get the number, don't look back at it within 30 seconds and dial that number. According to that concept, if we go past 30 seconds, and since we don't think we need that number again, and we haven't taken any steps to memorize it beyond short term, that we would have to look it up again because it's no longer there in our memory. And the reason for that, and that's a good thing, is because we don't need to clutter up our brain with a lot of information that we don't intend to revisit. So that's short-term memory. The next type of memory is called working memory. The word I want you to pick up on here is active. Short-term memory says you actively pursue some sort of strategy to memorize something for some period of time. So it's a little bit longer. You actually come up with strategies, maybe little acronyms or little terms or something, a little song you can make up. You actually come up with a way to memorize something. But the truth is, you're not really planning on thinking you need it a month from now or a year from now or 5 years from now. You just need it now, let's say, to take a test. So in a working memory, you would engage in systematic strategies to memorize things so that when you see it as a multiple choice, you can pull it from your memory, you retain it. But if I gave you the same test at the end of the semester, you would, and not revisit that material, you'd probably forget a lot of what you answered correctly the first time around. And that would show that you put it in working memory. It stayed for some time, but not permanently. But finally, the author says we have a thing called long-term memory, obviously the opposite of short-term. And long-term memory would indicate that it's unlimited in capacity and there is no time limit. So basically, you, in my opinion, have truly learned whatever the information is, or you have memories from your childhood that you can recall, and these things are with you always. They don't leave your memory. And so while as you get older, it may take a little longer to pull it from your memory and to process it, it is still there. The section on executive functioning, I'm looking at the PowerPoint screen of decision making on page 103 in the text. This is kind of common sense, but I'm going to give you a little test-taking tip here in that as we grow older, it is assumed that we develop better decision-making strategies. So any test question that offers you various ages of which of the following would be best at decision-making, and you think, well, how would I know? Just pick the oldest. So if they give you a choice between a child, an early adolescent, and a late adolescent, you would pick late adolescence. If the choice is between an early adolescent, a late adolescent, and an emerging adult, you would pick emerging adult, and so on. The thinking there is that as we get older, we are capable of using our prefrontal cortex more to engage in reasoning, problem solving, contingency thinking, if this then that, hypothetical reasoning, and all of these executive functions that we now are able to put to better use and with experience make better decisions. And so some of the things we should consider in decision making and help young people to learn to make better decisions is to learn from past experience, explore current options, and anticipate future consequences. And if they can take the time to go through that, and as they work and practice those strategies, they will be better at making decisions. The opposite of that would be personality traits in which the person is very impulsive, like an ADHD kid with impulsive type. They're not going to use those strategies. They're just going to react to the emotions triggered by the amygdala, and basically when they've made a mistake will say, I just wasn't thinking. And what they're talking about is they didn't really use any hypothetical steps to reason out a best decision. And the other personality type, other than impulsive, are people who are easily bored, and so they need a lot of stimulus. They're risk takers, so they don't really think things through very well, so they're quick to take a dare or try something or stir something up just for excitement. They do not like being bored at all. Okay? Now, also in decision making, your author talks about developing a knowledge base. And what they're talking about here, especially for young people, is young people have the ability to acquire knowledge, but they don't always apply the knowledge because they don't always believe that they definitely are going to have a problem in that area. In other words, they may be quite egocentric and think that while you may teach them driver's ed, for instance, and they can make 100 on the written test, they can drive the car and do all of that. The truth of the matter is, like I shared with you recently in I think the previous chapter, the number one reason for death among young people is accidental deaths. The number one type of accidental deaths, auto accidents. So while they've acquired the information about driving and safety and defensive driving and not drinking and so on, they do exactly the opposite once they get the driver's license. So they acquire knowledge, but they don't necessarily apply the knowledge. And that is not a very good decision-making process. I'm looking now at the PowerPoint called Reasoning, and there's two different types here I want you to be aware of, and the first one is called inductive reasoning, where we reason from the specific to the general. So we make generalizations based on very specific information, and that is called inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning would be, we know that dogs bark, and so we hear a noise, it's barking. We don't have to see that it's a dog. We can use inductive reasoning to say that is a dog barking out there and generalize that information that we have. Deductive reasoning is going from general to specific. So deductive reasoning would be like when you take your test and you have 4 choices. So maybe a good way to remember it is you're going to deduct those things that aren't possible, probable, or likely, and you're going to eventually come down to one answer. And so you're going to eliminate A, B, discuss C and D with yourself, and then decide. And so you're going to deduct those things, and they call that deductive reasoning. Okay? I want to move on here. Hang on just a minute. And by the way, I apologize. I gave you a bad example on that first one on inductive reasoning. That would have been a better example also for deductive. But reasoning from specific to general, let me give you another example that I think may be more helpful to you. And that would be doing a survey, for instance. So McNeese has, we'll say, 10,000 students. Well, you can't survey 10,000 students about their opinion about adequate parking. But you could interview 200 or 300 students, a specific group or a sample, and then apply that survey information, those findings. 80% of McNeese students, now you're talking about the whole student body, believe there is not adequate parking. That would be a better example. So I want to go back and give you that. Okay, creative thinking. Trying to keep 107. Creative thinking is totally different than IQ testing, for instance. Creative thinking is your ability to think in novel ways. So there is no one answer. Like in deductive reasoning, there's only one answer. You're going to eliminate 3 of the 4 and pick the correct answer. But creative thinking, there are multiple possibilities for answers. So there's no closed-ended question where you only come up with one answer. So for instance, the question would be more like, how many ways can you think of to use a paper clip? So you're going to get different responses from people. What they believe is that a very creative person is going to come up with more ways than maybe someone who is not creative and can only think of, oh, I don't know, it's just a paper clip. Someone else may think of, you could make a sewing needle out of it, you could make jewelry out of it, you could make a fish hook out of it, and so on, and they'll just keep going like that. And that's creative thinking. Now, creative thinking is called divergent thinking. So if you're looking for a synonym, or you see, or if that's one of your things you have to pick as a choice, they talk about convergent and divergent. Convergent is like deductive reasoning where there's only one answer. That would not be creative thinking. Divergent would be that there are many possible answers to this and many different options, like the example of the paperclip, and that's called divergent. And so they would ask questions like that, because the thing about creative thinking is that a person could have a high IQ but not be creative. They could answer questions on an IQ test, especially deductive reasoning questions, divergent questions, but they wouldn't necessarily be creative. But what they have found is that if a person is very creative, they're probably very bright people. So let me wrap today's lecture up with this thought about brainstorming, about creative thinking. An example of creative thinking is a thing called brainstorming, where you get a group of people together and you just let ideas flow freely without any interruption, criticism, or comment for some short period of time. For the next 15 minutes, one person will uh, be the scribe and write down any ideas. I think the author used an example of some young people coming up with the name of a band, their rock and roll band. And so that's fine. There may be other bands already named that, but you don't comment on that. You don't like that name, you don't say that. You just let the creativity flow for 15 minutes and then you stop. And then you can kind of start separating and eliminating. But for that period of time, the idea is to generate as much creativity within that group as possible. So I think I'm going to stop with that. And on Monday, I will wrap up this chapter and try to review with you as much as possible. And just a reminder that the test will be Wednesday. You have that 1 hour window starting at 8 a.m. We will let it go for 24 hours, but please don't put it off, and because it will cut you off when you run out of time. Okay? Thank you.